spring of 2013, a young woman named Melissa finally moved out of her mother's house and got her own place across town. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call, she'd answer, and she could hear them breathing, but they weren't saying anything. And then she started getting these huge bouquets of flowers delivered to her front step, but they were delivered from anonymous. Then after that, she started noticing things in her kitchen and her living room were going missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks and knives, little things, but since she lived alone and she was the only one moving these things, they really stood out. Melissa had this habit that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had this irrational fear if she didn't do that, that it would spark a fire and her house would burn down in the middle of the night. So she was pretty obsessive compulsive about always making sure the TV was unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night, around the same time she's getting these hang-up calls and there's flowers being sent to her door and things are going missing, she unplugs her TV and she goes up to bed. The next morning, she gets up and comes downstairs and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself that, well, she must have forgot to unplug the TV. As rare of an event as that is, it has to be what happened. And so that night, she unplugs the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug, confirming that, yes, I've unplugged the TV. And then she puts it down and looks again at the outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely not plugged in. And then she goes upstairs to bed. The next morning when she walks downstairs, she had the sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because her TV was right at the bottom of the stairs, that when she turned the corner, it would be plugged in again and her worst nightmare would come true, that something is happening on my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs and turns the corner, what does she see? The TV is plugged in again. She's horrified but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious act. And she's telling herself, well, maybe I forgot again, but then she's like, no, I remember last night staring at the plug. I definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, one, everything is locked, but two, no one else is in here. And when she's satisfied that, yup, it's empty down here, and two, everything is locked, she sits there thinking, well, now what do I do? Do I call the police and say, someone's plugging in my TV? You know, she can't do anything. And it was at this point that Melissa developed a very real fear of her first floor. And she began going to bed so early at night because she could not be on that floor when it started to get dark. And so imagine living alone, being afraid of going down to your first floor, how scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're going to attribute to your first floor. And so Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3 o'clock. The sun's not even down yet, but she's upstairs. But eventually it does get dark outside and she still has not fallen asleep. And so she sits up in bed and she turns on the TV. And right away, the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote. But then she remembers the remote's in my hand. And so she's looking at the remote and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote. And the channels are still cycling. Now, Melissa had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs TV was connected to her upstairs TV and vice versa. If one was changing the channel, in real time, the other changed the channel. And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels are changing, it dawns on her that someone downstairs is changing the channels. And so frozen in fear, all she can think to do is turn off her TV because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off. And so in total darkness, in a house she's already terrified of, she is straining her ears to try to hear some sign that this is either someone's down there flipping through channels, or this is nothing, and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's sitting there, all she can hear is her own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her chest. But she doesn't hear any sounds in her house. She doesn't hear the TV on. She doesn't hear footsteps, doors opening, none of that. It's silence in the house. So after what probably felt like an eternity, she just grabbed a pillow and clutched it in front of her and put her head into the pillow and just laid like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning when she gets up, the sun is out and it's this huge relief because suddenly with the sunlight pouring in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself, you know what, that had to have been just some anomaly with the skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I gotta tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens, that day she was going to a family birthday party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says, here's the strange things that are happening in my house with the skybox and all this. And at first, he looked at her like, really? This is what's going on? You're seeing ghosts in your house? But when she really focused on the specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the wall 2 separate times, and then the skybox thing. So the TV is kind of wrapped up in the weirdness that's been happening in her house, and the missing items in her house. And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a little bit weird. And he offered to live with her for a few days and just see it for himself. And as they're talking, their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, oh, I'll stay there too. For 4 days, the two brothers lived on the first floor of Melissa's house, and they don't see anything, they don't hear anything, it's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so finally, when her brothers are getting ready to leave after the 4th day, she was practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea of staying in this house. Her brothers reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird, anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her standards. It was like 3 o'clock, so the sun's getting close to going down, so she needs to go upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips around her house to confirm everything is shut, everything is locked, no one's in the house, everything is safe. And then she goes upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room, she hears the unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor. And then she hears the TV turn on. And her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set really, really high. So as soon as the TV went on, it blared all through the house. And immediately the TV turned back off because whoever turned it on knew that that was going to wake up whoever was in the house. Melissa doesn't know what to do. Before, whatever the heck was happening in her house was a little bit subtle. It was like she had to think about what she was hearing to confirm it was actually happening. Now, this person is just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and flipping on the TV and blaring it through the house. And so she immediately is like, oh my God, what do I do? And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother. Then he picks up right away and she goes, someone is in the house right now. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear and she gets up as slowly as she can and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother pull up as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her eye her brother's car pulls up across the street, and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors, and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, and he pauses, there's silence on the phone, and she goes, what do you see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm going to hang up and call the police, and I'm going to call you right back. Now, Melissa knew what she heard was very real to her, but to have it confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole nother level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder in my house right now, confirmed. They are right downstairs and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the police. Meanwhile, Melissa is just standing in this room, horrified as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just walk over to her door and look through the keyhole, which was oversized on her door. And if you look through it and over to the left, you'd actually look downstairs to the first floor. You'd only see a sliver of the first floor. And so very carefully, she walks her way over to the door. And as she kneels down to look through the keyhole, her phone rings. It was in her pocket and it wasn't on silent. It was on loud, and it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone. She drops it on the ground. It's still ringing. And she finally silences it. it, and then reflexively she pokes her head back and looks through the keyhole, and standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at her is a man with a hat pulled over his eyes who's clearly heard the sound, and he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs, and she hears this person who's in her house, because it was a voice she didn't recognize, screaming, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And then it's quiet. And so she opens that door because she wants to help if she can. And she looks and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding something. And he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head, and it's a frickin' knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy, and it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for months. They don't know how he got in, and he would never tell them, but he admitted that, yep, I was breaking in almost every single night. But he never gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister, but either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him.
One evening in late 2003, a 22-year-old man named Michael Bridges sat down in the stands of a professional hockey game in Calgary, which is a major city in Canada. And as he sat there staring out at the rink, waiting for the players to file in, he thought to himself how amazing it was that he was here right now. He couldn't believe how lucky he was to be here. So Michael lived about 700 miles away in a city called Brandon, which is also in Canada. And for the last year, Michael's life had gone really badly. He was struggling financially and in between jobs. He had gone through a recent terrible breakup. A lot of his friends had sort of vanished from his life. And so for the most part, he was sort of sad and lonely all the time. But then he'd won a sweepstakes that he had only entered on a whim and gotten an all-expenses-paid trip to Calgary for this hockey game. And so it felt like finally something good was happening in his life. Michael was about to flag down a vendor and order himself a beer when this guy he didn't know, this stocky guy with a mustache, walked in and sat down right next to Michael. And before Michael could say anything, this guy looked at him with a big smile on his face and he said, "Man, I'm so excited to be here. I won this ticket in a sweepstakes." And Michael was like, "Dude, me too." And so right away, these total strangers just totally hit it off. And before long, they were chatting about their lives. And, Michael, who over the last year, most of his friends had sort of disappeared in his life, it was great to have a guy that just seemed to get him. And so the time flew by. And Brock must have felt the same way about Michael, because as the hockey game ended, Brock asked Michael if he wanted to, keep the party going and go together to a strip club right down the road. And Michael was like, "Yeah, let's do it." And so the two new friends left the hockey game together, they went to the strip club, and as soon as they got there, Michael began to notice something odd about Brock, or at least something he hadn't noticed before. And that was that even though Brock appeared to be very blue collar, sort of like Michael was, Brock appeared to have a lot of money. I mean, he was leaving these huge tips for all the bartenders, and he was paying for he and Michael's drinks round after round. Brock was paying for all of it. And then also, Brock had this huge wad of ones and bills that he was basically throwing at all the dancers. And Michael, who was caught off guard by this, gladly accepted Brock's generosity. I mean, at this point, given Michael's financial struggles, he could not have afforded even a normal night out, let alone a lavish one like this. And so as the two men stood at the bar towards the end of the night, Michael thanked Brock for making this such a fun night, and he said he really didn't want to leave and go back to his hometown of Brandon, 700 miles away, because he was having so much fun here with Brock. But when he said Brandon, Brock stopped and he's like, "Wait a minute, Brandon? I'm moving to Brandon for work." And when Michael heard this, he was ecstatic. I mean, he was thinking this was going to be a one-off thing, that he would likely never see Brock again, despite how cool this guy was. But now it seemed entirely possible that if they were living in the same town, they could be actual friends. And so Brock told Michael that, "Hey, if you help me find an apartment in your hometown once I move there, maybe I can repay the favor by helping you get some work." And so Michael, he took one last look at that big wad of cash in Brock's hand, and he looked up at him and he said, "Deal." A couple of months later, in early December of 2003, Michael rode in the passenger seat of Brock's car as they made their way down a road in Brandon. The two had just had lunch together, and Brock was driving Michael home, when suddenly Brock's phone rang. And when Brock answered it, Michael could tell right away, just from the tone of Brock's voice, that he was speaking to his boss. So ever since that hockey game, Michael and Brock had become friends. Brock had moved to Brandon, and Michael had helped him find an apartment, and in exchange, Brock had made good on his promise and had helped Michael find some work. In fact, he had gotten him a few odd jobs with the company that he, Brock, worked for. However, these jobs were not what Michael expected them to be, based on, his first impression of Brock. In reality, he felt like these jobs were kinda shady. Brock had asked Michael to start delivering these packages all over town, but he warned Michael to never look inside of any of these packages. Now, at first, obviously, Michael had been very unsure about taking Brock up on these jobs. I mean, it was pretty clear that whatever Brock was doing was, questionable or maybe even illegal, like what's going on with these packages. But, Michael thought back to that huge wad of cash that Brock had at the strip club in Calgary, and it just seemed like he was throwing money around, and Michael wanted money like that too. And so he thought, what's the harm? And so ultimately, Michael agreed to deliver one of these packages, and when nothing bad happened, he began delivering more. Now, Michael still had no idea what he was actually delivering. He had heeded the warning and was not looking inside these packages. Instead, he had sort of accepted the shadowy, mysterious stuff that Brock was doing was just sort of part of being friends with Brock and working for Brock. And so he had just gone along with it. And also, Michael genuinely needed the money. He really couldn't afford to just stop working. So as the two men continued down this road in Brandon, Michael just continued to sit quietly in the passenger seat while he listened to Brock speak to his boss. And at some point in this conversation, Brock looked very resigned and just said, "Okay, I'll take care of it right now." Then Brock abruptly hung up, and without saying anything to Michael, he just pulled a U-turn and began speeding in the opposite direction. And then a couple of minutes later, Brock pulled into this parking lot of the seedy hotel, and then before Michael could ask, what are we doing here? Brock turned to him and said, "You stay here." And then Brock got out of the car, and he marched over to the door of this motel and began to knock. And Michael, he's in the car watching this, having no idea what's going on, and he sees the motel room door that Brock knocked on. It suddenly opened, and there was this woman who was inside the motel. And from Michael's perspective, it seemed like she was very startled to see Brock. And then she began trying to shut the door on Brock. But Brock, he reached out and he began pushing on the door to keep it open, and the two of them began yelling at each other. And Michael, he can't hear what they're yelling about, but clearly, they're having some sort of heated argument here. And at this point, Michael began looking around, hopeful that nobody was witnessing this. I mean, they could get in some serious trouble here. And then Michael turned his attention back to Brock and this woman, and he watched as Brock raised his fist and punched this woman square in the face. And she instantly crumpled to the ground, and Michael, he has no idea what to do here. And so he just sat there as Brock climbed on top of this woman who's laying on the ground, and he began repeatedly punching her over and over again until Michael could see blood all over her face. And then Brock, who seemed totally unfazed, slammed the motel room door and calmly walked back to the car, hopped in the driver's seat, and drove off without saying anything to Michael. And Michael just sat quietly for this ride. He really had no idea what to even say. Now, he already knew that Brock must be involved in some sort of criminal enterprise, and in virtue of Michael delivering those packages for him, he was also involved in whatever this organization did. But up until this point, up until seeing this beating take place, Michael had sort of assumed that whatever Brock was involved in couldn't be that big of a deal. I mean, certainly they weren't hurting people. But now, Michael realized he had been terribly wrong. Finally, Brock pulled up in front of Michael's house, and for the first time he spoke. He turned to Michael and he said, "Don't tell anyone what you saw." And Michael just nodded his head and said, "Yeah, I won't." And then Michael got out of the car and he rushed inside his house. About a week later, Michael was at his home when his phone rang, and when he looked at the caller ID, he saw it was Brock. And at first, Michael couldn't help but feel like he didn't want to pick up the call, but he knew he would have to. Despite what had happened the previous week at the motel, Michael had not said anything to anyone. However, being loyal to Brock did not make him feel any better about it. In reality, Michael felt like at this point, he was in too deep with Brock, and he had no idea how to get out again, even though at this point he kind of wanted to. But for now, Michael had made the conscious decision to simply act like everything is the same, everything is normal, so he didn't raise any red flags with Brock. And so he ultimately picked up the phone. Brock didn't say hello or ask Michael how he was doing. Instead, he just told Michael that he had another delivery for him if Michael was still committed to this job. Now, Michael knew the right answer here would be to turn this down and not continue to go down this rabbit hole and get deeper and deeper in with Brock. But at the same time, Michael was worried if he refused this job that he might be put in danger. Like, he saw what Brock was capable of. Is that going to happen to him if he turns this down? And then on top of that, Michael needed the money. And so after a tense silence, Michael told Brock that yes, I'm still committed and I will do this delivery. Brock said that was very good. And he also told Michael that he and the boss were very impressed with Michael's silence. And then Brock hung up. Now, Michael did appreciate the compliment, but at the same time, it really did not change his situation at all. I mean, he was still in way too deep here and didn't know what he was going to do. And so reluctantly, he grabbed his keys and headed out to his car to go pick up this next package. 2 months later, in early February of 2004, Michael and Brock sat inside of a diner in Brandon eating a meal together. Things at this point had basically gone back to normal. Michael was regularly delivering packages for Brock, and the two of them were meeting for meals like this fairly often, where Brock would always foot the bill. But today, as Michael sat there staring at Brock, he could tell something was different. Brock seemed really agitated, like something was on his mind. He kept tapping his hand and kind of fidgeting in his seat. And eventually, Michael asked Brock, like, hey, are you okay? And to Michael's surprise, Brock kind of lit up, and he was like, oh yeah, I'm okay. In fact, things are more than okay. I actually have an offer for you that could potentially change your life. Brock again told Michael that he and the boss were seriously impressed with Michael's work so far. Not just the fact that he kept silent about the motel incident, but also they knew Michael clearly had not looked inside of any of those packages. And so collectively, this proved that Michael was dependable and loyal. And so he told Michael that what he wanted to do was introduce Michael to the boss, because he thought maybe the boss would take a liking to Michael and move him up in the organization. Maybe give him a more managerial role like Brock's, where the role was more prestigious and had more responsibility, but critically came with higher pay. After hearing this, Michael felt both excited and nervous. He was excited because he wanted nothing more than to make the kind of money that Brock did. And after working with Brock now for several months, Michael had become kind of desensitized to violence and danger. He realized he could put his morals aside if it meant he would never have to be financially insecure ever again. But the thing that made Michael nervous was meeting the boss. I mean, he really didn't know much about who this guy was. All he knew is he was perfectly prepared to resort to violence if people wronged him. And so Michael knew how critical it was to stay on this guy's good side. But as all these conflicting thoughts were swirling around Michael's head, Brock said something else. He said before he would actually take Michael to meet the boss, Michael had to pass one more test. Michael would have to prove that he was capable of more than simply delivering packages and keeping secrets. Basically, he needed to prove that he could be as cutthroat and brutal as Brock was. After saying this, Brock just kind of leaned back and stared at Michael, studying his reaction. And at first, Michael really didn't even know what to say or do. He was like, okay, is Brock expecting me to come up with, some sort of way that I can demonstrate this? Do I need to come up with a test myself and do it? Or is Brock about to give me some assignment? Like, what's going on here? But then, before Brock could say anything else to clarify this whole situation, Michael had this epiphany. He suddenly realized that he already had the proof he needed to demonstrate to Brock and to the boss that he could basically handle anything they threw at him. Before meeting Brock, something truly awful and just totally messed up happened in Michael's life, and Michael had persevered his way through it. And so Michael was thinking to himself, if he just told the story of what happened to Brock and to the boss, they would be convinced that he was their guy. And so feeling very confident, Michael looked Brock right in the eye and he told him about his past. And as he told the story, Brock's eyes went wide. And by the end of the story, when Michael finally finished up, Brock just said, okay, yeah, you're ready to meet the boss. The meeting with the boss was scheduled for a few days later. And on that day, Michael showed up to this fancy hotel in a nearby city. And when he walked into the lobby, he saw Brock was sitting there waiting for him. When Brock saw Michael, he smiled and stood up, gestured for Michael to come over, and then the two of them walked upstairs to a particular hotel room. But when Brock unlocked the hotel room door and the two men went inside this lavish suite with this gorgeous living room and an amazing view, Michael looked around and realized it was empty. And he said to Brock, like, where's the boss? And Brock said, the boss doesn't wait for anyone. People wait for the boss. And so just sit down he'll be here soon. And so Michael said okay, and he took a seat and tried to stay calm. But in reality, he was very nervous. I mean, all this cloak and dagger stuff was really putting him on edge. He also knew he had to impress the boss when he got here, because if he did, he would have like this new lease on life, this big promotion, he'd be getting paid so much money. But if he didn't, if he failed to impress the boss, not only would he potentially be out of a job and back to sort of poverty, but also he could be in real danger here. And so as Michael is sitting there showing all the signs that he's totally nervous, Brock, who was in the room just kind of standing there, looked over and could sense, his friend clearly is on edge. And so he said, "Hey, Michael, here we go. Why don't you just run me through your story one more time, like a dry run, before you meet the boss. Get yourself ready." And so Michael, who at this point was so anxious, he was happy to be doing anything other than just sitting there quietly, quickly agreed to the idea and went through his story one more time. And right as he finished his story, there was a knock on the door. And so Brock said, "Okay, he's here. Are you ready?" And Michael's like, "Yeah, I'm ready." And so Brock walked over to the door, took one more look at Michael, opened it up, and when Michael looked outside and saw who was out there, he knew immediately he had made a terrible mistake. It would turn out the last several months of Michael's life was one big lie. That sweepstakes that Michael had won that got him the tickets to the game in Calgary, that wasn't real. Somebody had set that up just so Michael could meet Brock. Those packages that Michael was delivering for Brock, they were not sensitive. It was just packages that contained flour, like cooking flour. And that woman that Michael watched Brock beat up at the motel, she was acting, and so was Brock. Nobody got hurt in that entire altercation, and the blood that Michael saw on her face, well, she had blood capsules hidden in her mouth that she popped to make it look like she actually got beat up. However, there was one thing that was absolutely true about the last few months of Michael's life, and that was that Brock really was involved in a secretive organization, and Brock really did want to bring Michael inside of it. It's just that the organization was not the criminal enterprise that Michael thought it was. Instead, it was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And Brock was an undercover officer running an elaborate sting designed entirely to get Michael to confess to his crimes, which he did while secret cameras inside of that hotel room recorded every single word he said. Michael's crime was murder. 2 years earlier, his girlfriend, Erin Chorney, had tried to break up with him, and he'd been so mad about it that he attacked her, wound up strangling her until she fell unconscious, and then he drowned her in the bathtub. And so this was the story he told Brock and intended to tell the boss to convince them that he was their guy, that he was tough and could do anything they wanted. He basically was telling them, "Hey guys, I'm literally a murderer." And so when they heard that knock on the door in the hotel room and Michael turned, expecting it to be the boss, well, instead, he saw a whole bunch of police officers coming into the hotel room to arrest him for that murder that he confessed to. Erin's body was ultimately recovered from the dump site where Michael had left her, and she was given a proper burial. As for Michael, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison.
In February of 2013, a young woman named Kim finally moved out of her parents' house, and she moved into this tiny little apartment that she absolutely loved. Kim had severe social anxiety. She could not stand being out in public, talking to people she didn't know, and so she would do everything in her power to stay indoors. She had a job that didn't require her to travel, and so having this little apartment was like her little oasis. When she was there, she was safe. If she had to leave, she was practically running to her car and running back so she didn't have to talk to anybody. In those first few weeks she was living there, as much as she tried to avoid all contact with other people, there was one person she was kind of forced to have an interaction with, and that was her landlord. But her landlord turned out to be this awesome old woman named Olivia, who really took a liking to Kim and kind of looked at Kim as like her daughter. And Kim was surprised at herself for wanting to interact with Olivia. She was very comforting and she was this really nice lady. And so even though they didn't actually interact that much, they developed this relationship where Olivia liked to make food, and she'd come over to Kim's door and she'd knock and she'd leave it outside of her door, and she didn't expect Kim to come out and talk to her. She knew Kim was uncomfortable being out in public, and so she didn't push her to do that. Instead, she just expected her to eat some nice food, and whenever Kim was done eating, to put her dishes back outside the door, and Olivia would take it up and she would go clean it, and that was that. And so Kim really grew to love Olivia and was very happy to have her there. It was like she made her feel safe. 2 months after moving into this tiny little new apartment, Kim started taking a new medication for her anxiety. Now, historically, she had taken a whole bunch of different medications and knew when you start a new one, it's not uncommon to have a whole bunch of side effects that you're just not used to and they're kind of awful and you need some time to get used to them. So at the same time she's taking this new medication, she starts to notice that she's forgetting things. Things in her apartment are being put in places she does not remember putting them. And things are going missing and she can't remember where she put them. And so even though she was expecting side effects from this new drug, she was really frustrated with the memory loss. She also noticed this medication made her exceptionally drowsy to the point where most days she had to take a nap for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day just to get through the day. Because Kim had such intense anxiety about being out in public, she did not want to go to the doctors to get a different prescription or to even talk to the doctor about, is this normal? Because that doctor's visit would necessitate a whole bunch of interactions with people she doesn't want to interact with. And so she decided, you know what? I'm just going to take my medication. I'm going to let myself adjust to this new normal and everything will be just fine. During the time period that she's experiencing all these side effects that she is attributing to her new medication, she got a delivery from Olivia. It was a Greek salad that she knew Kim loved, and Kim's psyched about this Greek salad. She brings it in her apartment and she decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have a nice day to myself. I'm going to go in my bedroom. I'm going to turn on Netflix and I'm going to eat this salad in bed. It's going to be awesome. And so she's sitting in bed, she's eating her salad, she's watching Portlandia, and then she falls asleep right in the middle. Like as she's eating her salad, she's falling asleep. She's so tired. When she woke up, she's like, wow, I've never fallen asleep that hard and that fast before. And she's literally still got the fork in her hand from eating her salad. And then she notices on the other side of the bed, the left side of the bed, the sheets are all disturbed, like someone has been laying there. And Kim always sleeps on the right side of the bed. It was almost like a compulsion for Kim that she could never sleep on the left side, like it was bad luck. And she reaches her hand out and she feels that side of the bed where it's been disturbed and it's still warm. And so she quickly thinks to herself, well, I guess I must have rolled over and laid on that side of the bed and then rolled back to this side, just miraculously right back in the same position I was in with the salad fork still in hand. And that's when it kind of clicks in her head, like, that's not possible. That's not possible. So what does that mean? Does that mean someone's in my apartment right now? And so she leaps out of bed, she gets her phone, she enters 911 and she's ready to dial it, and she flips on all the lights in her apartment, she's running around and there's no one in her apartment. The apartment's still locked, everything is normal. And so she puts her phone away and her heart's still racing. She's very stressed out about what's just occurred. Because in her mind, in the back of her mind anyways, she knows she didn't roll over. That didn't happen. This is when Kim began to wonder, are all these strange happenings in my apartment connected to what just happened now? Because this incident right here does not feel medication side effect driven. And so all of a sudden she's looking at the other weird things in her apartment, like the missing toothbrush and the missing shoes and things getting moved around, as suddenly connected. And it dawns on her that maybe she's been blind to something else happening. Maybe someone is breaking into my apartment. So for the next couple of days, Kim watched her apartment like a hawk to see if there was any indication of somebody breaking into her apartment at any point. And there was nothing. She always locked the door. She always kept the windows shut. The only thing that stood out to her was when she woke up in the mornings, her bedroom had a very distinctive smell to it. It wasn't her smell, and it wasn't a smell she was used to. It was like another person's smell, and it really freaked her out. She decided, it's time to tell my parents. And so when she tells her parents and she's describing out loud what's been going on in her apartment, it's the first time she's hearing herself say this stuff out loud. And it sounds way more creepy and way more scary than it did in her own head. And so as she's telling them, she's becoming scared to go back to her apartment. And her dad picks up on that and says, hey, I'll go back with you. We'll look around your apartment and we'll make sure it's safe and secure. And then on the way out, we'll check in with your landlady and we'll let her know what's going on. So she's brought in and everything's going to be fine. They go back to her apartment, they go inside, and when they walk in, everything looks normal. They kind of do a walk through the apartment, looks normal. But before her dad leaves, he says, hey, let me just do a closer inspection of your whole apartment. Let me look everywhere and make sure there's not like some special way to get in here, just to give you peace of mind. And so he went into her bedroom and he starts looking around and he's lifting up the mattress and looking underneath. And then he opens up her closet, which is this big closet, lots of clothes in there. It's not quite a walk-in closet, but it's big enough that you can easily stand in there. And her father reaches in and splits the clothes and he uses his light to look at all of the back wall. And he pushes on it and he taps on it and he sees if there's any sort of special special compartment? There's not. But before he walks out again, he notices a little blurb of writing on the bottom right corner of the inner wall, an area that you could only see if you were standing in the closet looking for strange things on the wall of the inside of his closet. He kneels down to take a look at it, and it's this little tiny blurb of text that says, "Come back here so I can look at you." And the only way you could write it is if you were laying down in this tiny little corner facing the exit of the closet. And that's when her father looks at the bottom of the closet, and one of the slats on the closet door was missing. And so in theory, if you were someone that was writing this message, you'd be laying down where your eyes would be looking through that slat right at her bed. Her father put it together and he stood up. He walked out to his daughter and he said, "Come over here." He showed her what's in her closet and he said, "Did you write that?" And she goes, "No." And he goes, "All right, it's time to leave." They walk outside, they go to his truck, and he calls the police and he says, "Someone's breaking into my daughter's apartment." Police show up, and using CCTV footage, they capture a grown man regularly going into Kim's apartment in the middle of the night, and he clearly has a key. It would turn out to be Olivia's grown adult son named Henry, who lived with her, who apparently, as soon as he saw Kim for the first time, he fell madly in love with her and became very obsessed with her, and he developed this fake relationship in his mind where he believed he and Kim were dating, even though Kim didn't even know Henry existed. She didn't even know he was living with Olivia. She had never seen him before. During questioning, Henry said what he did is he got sleeping pills and he ground them up, and anytime his mother was delivering food to Kim, which she loved to do, and she was always excited about it, so she was talking about it so he would know it was happening, he would put sleeping pills in her food, he would mix it in, and then he knew as soon as it was delivered, she would be asleep, and he would use his mother's spare key to go into the apartment, and what he said he did is he never touched her. He never laid a hand on Kim. Instead, he laid next to her in bed or watched her from inside the closet. So for the 4 months that Kim lived in this apartment, where she believed every time she came inside and shut the doors that she was kind of away from society, she could just be alone in her bubble, well, in reality, there was some psychopath just a few feet away from her almost the entire time. When Olivia found out about all of this, she made a point to tell Kim she had nothing to do with it, and she was terribly sorry, but...
On the morning of August 30th, 2001, a middle-aged police sergeant named Alan McGregor drove with his partner, Officer Mark David, towards the Huron National Forest, which is a massive nature preserve in northern Michigan. The two of them were on the way to this forest to meet with a very unlikely detective, who McGregor believed might actually be the key to solving a case that had haunted him for the last 21 years. And that case was the disappearance of Cherita Thomas. Back in 1980, Cherita Thomas had been walking down the road, located about 1 mile away from the police station where Sergeant McGregor worked, when she had gotten into the car with this older man who had come by to pick her up. And after getting in this car, she was never seen again. Based on various tips and clues, police were nearly certain that that older man who had picked Cherita up was a guy named Jimmy Nelson. And their theory was he had murdered Cherita shortly after picking her up, and then afterwards disposed of her body in a particular section of the Huron National Forest. But the problem was, the police did not have any actual evidence that supported this theory. Their case against Jimmy was entirely circumstantial. In fact, they didn't even know if Cherita had really been murdered, because for the last 20 plus years, they had searched that particular section of the Huron National Forest, they'd gotten the FBI involved, they had chased down every lead, yet still, they had not found Cherita's body. So they really didn't know what happened. But as Sergeant McGregor neared the forest, he hoped that today would be the day that all changed. He pulled up by the entrance of the Huron National Forest, and he and his partner got their first look at their unlikely detective they were here to meet. And this detective was a Doberman Pinscher mix with big floppy ears who was lying on the ground and panting and wagging his tail. His name was Eagle, and he didn't look like a stereotypical police dog because he wasn't a police dog. However, Eagle was the best crime scene sniffing dog in the entire world. His trainer, a 40-year-old woman named Sandra Anderson, was standing right beside him. Now, Sandra and Eagle were very famous in law enforcement circles, and so Sergeant McGregor and his partner were already well aware of their backstory. Sandra had actually adopted Eagle from a pound shortly before he likely would have been euthanized. And then after she adopted him, Sandra, who had made a career in teaching dogs how to sniff for cadavers, just sort of naturally on her off time, began training Eagle how to do it too. And amazingly, Eagle really took to it, better than police dogs did. Now, any good police cadaver dog could sniff out hidden objects and track a scent for miles, and Eagle could definitely do that. But also, Eagle could do things that the police cadaver dogs simply could not. Like he could smell blood that had been cleaned with bleach and also painted over. I mean, that's like a superpower. No dog could do that, but Eagle could. One forensic anthropologist who had come in contact with Eagle and seen what he could do firsthand said that, if a great cadaver dog was rated a 10 out of 10, well, Eagle was like a 20 out of 10. He was far and away the best of the best. And so Sergeant McGregor believed that if Cherita's body really was in that section of the Huron National Forest, well, Eagle would be able to find it. Sergeant McGregor was excited to see Eagle in action. But after he and his partner parked, they walked over and spent a minute, petting Eagle because Sandra said it was fine, and they gave him some pets, and Eagle really liked it, and he sort of rubbed up against them. But then at some point, Eagle just kind of stopped and looked towards the entrance of the National Forest, like he was ready to go. At which point Sandra said, okay, he's ready to work. So Sergeant McGregor and his partner followed behind Sandra and Eagle as they led the way into the forest towards the section where they had been told to search. And then once they reached that section, McGregor and his partner kind of stayed back on the fringes and just watched Eagle work. And it was incredible. Now, McGregor and his partner had seen police dogs work before, so they were familiar with basically the pace at which these dogs would find something, which often, it would take some time. But basically, as soon as they got to this clearing, they're watching Eagle and he's sort of walking around, sniffing, looking for something. But then suddenly he stopped, turned, and made a beeline towards this tree. And when he got there, he began pawing at the ground like he had found something. Sandra, his trainer, kneeled down next to him to see what Eagle had found, and she saw as he continued to dig that there was something in the ground. And so she called out to McGregor and his partner, and they came rushing over, and sure enough, Eagle had found a human bone fragment. To be clear, this dog only finds human bones, and so it's not like it would be able to find a chicken bone and think it was a human bone. Basically, if it found a bone, it's a human bone. McGregor and his partner were totally shocked here. I mean, they had really high hopes for the search, but to already be finding human remains in this particular section of the forest was revelatory. I mean, not only was it a big deal to find human remains here, but these could be Cherita's. This could be the key to unlocking this 2 decades old case. But Sandra, Eagle's trainer, did not seem shocked at all. This was pretty much par for the course. She smiled at the 2 investigators and kind of shrugged like, yep, this is what he does. She gave him a treat. And then Eagle got up and just continued searching the area. Thank you to my sponsor, Happy Face, on Paramount+. Growing up, Melissa had what looked like the perfect life. A loving family and great friends. Until the day it all came crashing down, when she discovered her father's dark secret. He was the notorious Happy Face killer. Paramount Plus presents the thrilling new original series, Happy Face, inspired by a true life story. After years without contact, Melissa's father reaches out to confess to another murder. However, there's a twist. Another man is already on death row for that crime. Now, Melissa must choose between keeping her secret and protecting her perfect life, or unraveling an unsolved mystery to save an innocent man, and decide how far she'll go to uncover the truth. Annalee Ashford and Dennis Quaid star in Happy Face. New series now streaming exclusively on Paramount+. After Sandra and Eagle had taken off, McGregor and his partner bagged the bone fragment and then just kind of continued to let Eagle do his work. And over the course of that day, Eagle just kept on finding more human bones. It was truly incredible. And then the next day, when they came back for a second search, Eagle found even more. It was like there were human bones all over the place. However, this was actually kind of typical for human remains that have been left out in the wild for a long time, like they believed Cherita's had been. The idea is, after the body is left there and decomposes, animals come along and break apart the bones and kind of carry them in different directions. There's weather, there's a bunch of things that affect the body that sort of gradually takes it and spreads it all over the place. But as alarming as it was to find this many human bone fragments in such a small area in this forest, at the end of that second search on the second day, McGregor, all he could feel was elation. He felt like Eagle had done the exact thing he was hoping he would do. He had found the remains that very likely were Cherita Thomas's. McGregor thanks Sandra and Eagle profusely for their help, and then after saying bye to them, he and his partner went back to the station and they sent off the bone fragments to the FBI to be analyzed. And then after sending them off, they waited. The analysis would take several months, but in February of 2002, the FBI finally called McGregor. Now at this point, McGregor was very hopeful and sort of expected that these bone fragments would belong to Cherita, but what they actually said shocked him, because according to the FBI, those bone fragments that Eagle had dug up did not belong to Cherita. In fact, the bone fragments didn't even belong to a single person. They belonged to 3 different people. And when McGregor heard this, his blood ran cold, because he wasn't thinking, oh boy, this totally blows up the case. Instead, he's thinking, I bet Cherita is out in that forest. We just haven't found her yet, and if we keep using Eagle, we will find her. But now I have at least 3 more people that have been found out there, 3 dead people. So maybe Jimmy is way worse than I thought he was. Maybe he didn't just kill Cherita, maybe he's a serial killer and he's dumping his bodies in that part of the forest. However, as explosive as this new information was, it only made things way more complicated for McGregor, because he and his partner and all of his colleagues had no idea who these 3 new bodies were, and neither did the FBI. The FBI could only determine that these bone fragments came from 3 different people, but who they were, they didn't know. And so, to try to figure out who these 3 people were, Sergeant McGregor would need to find more clues. And to find more clues, he needed Eagle to go back to the forest and keep on looking. And so he immediately reached out to Sandra, who said that she and Eagle would come back out there and search the forest again. The new search began on April 17th, 2002. McGregor, his partner, Sandra, Eagle, and a whole bunch of police officers and crime lab technicians descended once again on that same section of the Huron National Forest. But after a kind of lengthy search that day, the police officers, the entire police force that showed up, they didn't find anything of note. But Eagle, he did. At some point, Eagle had sniffed out a human knuckle bone in a dried out stream bed. When this discovery was made, Officer McGregor was elated, because it was like, once again, we are finding evidence that's going to help him break this case he has been trying to crack for 20 years, which now might actually be way bigger than he thought it was. It might not just be the murder of Cherita. This might be the hunting grounds or the dumping grounds of a serial killer who killed Cherita Thomas. And he, McGregor, was going to be the one who solved it. He just knew it. But when McGregor turned back around to continue searching in the area that he was looking, he suddenly heard this commotion coming from behind him, sort of in the same direction where that human knuckle bone had been found. And he turns around and he sees what looks to be some sort of physical altercation happening amongst 2 people. He can't really tell who it is, but there's screaming happening. It's total chaos. And so, having no idea what was going on, McGregor abandoned his search, turned, and ran to go break it up. And after this fight was broken up, another major discovery was made. But it was not another bone. It would turn out the person who was dumping bodies in this section of the Huron National Forest was not a serial killer, nor was it Jimmy Nelson. Instead, the real culprit was actually one of the investigators who was out here doing this search right now. Eagle was not the world's greatest cadaver-sniffing dog. In fact, Eagle was not even a cadaver-sniffing dog at all. And his trainer, Sandra, was well aware of that, because this was all a big act. It would turn out, when Sandra and her dog were called out to a site to perform a search, Sandra would show up with a stash of human bones tucked into her clothing, right up against her skin. And then once the search began, she would discreetly pull little bone fragments out and drop them on the ground in front of Eagle, who would immediately notice them and alert people to them, making it seem like Sandra and her dog had once again saved the day. Sandra did this dozens of times across dozens of searches all over the country, all because she loved the thrill of watching the police discover her crimes in real time. Sandra had been successfully searching for body parts that she herself had planted for years without anybody being remotely suspicious of her. However, during the search for Cherita Thomas, Sandra got caught. Right before that fight broke out on that last search, Sandra and her dog had stepped off to the side and believed nobody was watching them, and Sandra bent down and pulled a bone fragment out of her sock and was about to place it, but then realized a crime lab technician was clearly watching her. She had been caught. And so the crime lab technician went up to Sandra to call her out on it, and Sandra, who knew she was caught, began to panic and pretended that she was being attacked by the crime lab technician and made a whole scene about it. That's what McGregor heard when he turned around and wondered if there was a fight going on. There was no fight. It was just Sandra, again, being caught red-handed. But as awful as Sandra's actions sound, she didn't actually kill anyone. Instead, during her years-long run of fraudulent searching, she had been stealing pieces of medical center cadavers and using those. Sandra ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felonies, including falsifying evidence and obstruction of justice, and so she was sentenced to 21 months in prison. After she was caught, the FBI had to go back and reevaluate 50 murder cases that Sandra and Eagle had been involved in. Luckily, though, during this examination, they discovered that in all of these cases, they did not hinge on evidence that Sandra had found, and so there were no convictions that were overturned. As for Jimmy Nelson, he was eventually convicted of Cherita's murder. However, his conviction was overturned. But it had nothing to do with Sandra and Eagle. The evidence used to overturn it was completely separate. And so to this day, we still don't know what happened to Cherita, and her body has still not been found. As for Eagle, nobody was mad at him, and he retired from working crime scenes and got as many treats as he wanted until he passed away peacefully in 2003.
On October 17, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital. And so they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, you know what, let's just be sure, let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked. They tried the other door, that was locked too. They looked in the windows, it was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door for them. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down. He has been bludgeoned to death. The police immediately draw their weapons and they're looking around the house thinking someone could still be here. And they clear the whole house and there's no one there. And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene was. Nothing in the house was vandalized. Nothing in the house was stolen. And Phil himself was just a very modest, retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies, and so the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But then you got to remember that when police first got there before they discovered his body, the house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. And so whoever was in there with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil enough to have a key of their own or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime when the obvious angles, such as theft, vandalism, revenge, have basically been crossed off. Not to mention, there was virtually no evidence of who could have done this, with the exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. So there was nothing on it, no fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. 9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence and she hears the tapping and it's coming from the kitchen. And she thinks, oh, it's got to be a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the other side of the kitchen was a door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening. And out from behind comes this white hand that reaches to the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams and the hand retracts back into the space, and then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent again. She ran out of the house and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer is back. And they're looking all through the house and there's nothing. There's not even a sign of a break-in. And so the police go back to the housekeeper and to Miss Peters. They explain that we couldn't find anyone, but given the history of your house, we don't think it's safe for you to be in there. And so the housekeeper didn't go back, and Miss Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be looked after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have 2 detectives that are outside this house watching it at all times. And so 2 detectives go and they're sitting outside, and for a couple of days they're not seeing anything, they're not hearing anything, and they decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house, they go upstairs, they look around, they don't see anything, they go back downstairs, and as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs. They both heard it, so they go upstairs and they start searching different rooms, and one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet, and past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps head first into the closet and grabs the foot of this mystery person who's crawling into a tiny little panel in the back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out, and he's yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in. They both grab this person and they yank this person out, and they would describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Conies, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Conies moved in, he had fallen on hard times. He was sleeping in alleyways, and as it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe an opportunity to crash at his house for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital visiting his wife who had a broken hip. And so the house was vacant. And Conies saw an opportunity and he broke in. And at first his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You'd have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering head first in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult. So you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Conies saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And so he went around the house gathering supplies between blankets and food and water, and he filled his tiny little space. And then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door again, made sure everything looked the way it was when he showed up. And he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks, Phil never noticed a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Conies would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, then go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's wiring system and stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into the cubby with him, attached it to the new wiring, and he got to listen to the news so he didn't feel so isolated from the outside world. But about a month later, Conies leaves his little spot to go downstairs because he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going through the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, "What are you doing in my kitchen?" In a panic, Conies grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it where it is. He goes in the fridge, he gets some more food and drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives. He would follow the investigation of Phil Peters' death on his radio, curled up inside of Phil Peters' house. Conies was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years."